In the year 1188, innumerable forces from England, France, Italy, and other countries rushed with impetuous ardor to Palestine. In the year 1189, 100,000 crusaders under Guy de Lusignan sat down before the city of Acre. The siege lasted for 2 years, with a vast consumption of lives on both sides. At length the city capitulated, and the Mussulmans surrendered to the victorious arms of Richard the Lion-hearted, King of England. This Third Crusade is remarkable for the number of European sovereigns who were personally engaged in it. Richard of England, Philip Augustus of France, Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, and the Dukes of Swabia and of Burgundy had all left their dominions to be governed by regents in their absence, and had joined in the pious struggle to redeem the Holy Land from Mohammedan rule. But notwithstanding many victories over Saladin in hard-fought fields, and the conquest of many important places such as Acre, Ascalon, Jaffa, and Caesarea, Crusaders failed in their great design of recovering Jerusalem, which still remained in the possession of Saladin, who, however, having made a truce with King Richard, granted as one of the terms free and undisturbed access to all pilgrims who should visit the Holy City. Thus terminated the Third Crusade. It can scarcely be called an absolute failure, notwithstanding that Jerusalem still remained in the hands of the infidels, but the total ruin with which, at its commencement, the Latin kingdom had been threatened was averted. The conquering progress of the Mussulmans had been seriously checked. The hitherto victorious Saladin had been compelled to make a truce. The greater part of the seacoast of Palestine, with all its fortresses, and the cities of Acre, Jaffa, Antioch, and Tyre, remained in the possession of the Christians. Saladin had survived the truce which he had made with Richard but a few months, and on his death his dominions were divided between 3 of his sons and his brother Safhaddin. The last of these, to whom most of the veterans who had fought under Saladin adhered, secured for himself a sovereignty in Syria. The death of their renowned and powerful foe had encouraged the Christians of Palestine to make renewed efforts to recover Jerusalem as soon as the truce had expired. To aid in this design, a new crusade was invoked in Europe. The appeal, heard with apathy in England and France, met with more favor in Germany. 3 large armaments of German chivalry arrived at Acre in 1195. The campaign lasted, however, less than 2 years, and the troops, having effected no decisive results, were recalled to Germany in consequence of the death of the Emperor Henry VI. This, which has been dignified by some writers with the name of a Fourth Crusade, has, however, more generally been considered as a mere episode in the history of the Holy Wars. The Fourth Crusade proper began in the year 1203, when a large armament of knights and men-at-arms of France, Germany, Italy, and Flanders sailed for Constantinople in transports furnished by the Venetians and commanded by the blind Doge Dandolo. The throne of the Byzantine Empire had been usurped by the elder Alexius, who had imprisoned his brother, the legitimate monarch, after having caused his eyes to be put out. The first object of the Crusaders was to dethrone the usurper, and to restore the government to Isaac and his son, the younger Alexius, who had instigated the enterprise and accompanied the expedition. The siege and the conquest of Constantinople is told in the graphic language of Gibbon, but it is so wholly unconnected with the subject of our present inquiry as not to claim further attention. It is sufficient to say that by it the Crusaders were entirely diverted from the great object for which they had left Europe. None ever reached or sought to reach the land of Palestine, and the Fourth Crusade terminated without a blow having been struck for the recovery of Jerusalem and the deliverance of the Holy Sepulchre from the pollution of its Paynim possessors. The Fifth Crusade commenced in the year 1217. In this war, the Crusaders attacked Egypt, believing that that country was the key to Palestine. At first they were successful, and besieged and captured the city of Damietta. But influenced and directed by the cupidity and ignorance of the papal legate, they refused the offer of the Saracens that if the Christians would evacuate Egypt, they would cede Jerusalem to them. They continued the campaign with most disastrous results, and finally, abandoning the contest, the Crusaders returned to Europe in 1229, never having even seen the shores of the Holy Land. A sixth crusade was undertaken by the French in 1238. They were subsequently joined by Richard, Earl of Cornwall, the nephew of Richard the Lionhearted. The military capacity and prowess of this able leader led to successful results, and in 1240 to the restoration of Jerusalem to the Christians. The crusade ended with the return of the Earl of Cornwall to England in 1240. The fortifications of Jerusalem were rebuilt by the Knights Templars, but the necessary measures for defense had scarcely been completed when the Christian kingdom was attacked by a new enemy. The descendants of those barbaric tribes of Tartars, who under the name of Huns had centuries before overwhelmed the Roman Empire, now commenced their ravages in Asia Minor. 20,000 Turkoman horsemen under Barbachan, their chief, assisted by Egyptian priests, were enabled in 1242 to wrest Jerusalem from the Christians, who never again recovered it. The war continued with scarcely varying disasters to the Christians. Palestine was overrun by the barbarous hordes of Turkomans. The Muslims of Damascus, Aleppo, and Ems, forgetful of their ancient hatred and religious conflicts, united with the Knights Templars to oppose a common enemy. But the effort to stay the progress of the Turkoman invasion was vain. Every city of the Latin kingdom, such as Tiberias, Ascalon, Jaffa, and others, were conquered. Acre alone remained to the Christian chivalry, and the Holy Sepulchre was again in the possession of the infidels. A seventh crusade was commenced in 1245 to recover what had been lost. It was undertaken by the chivalry of England and France. Louis IX commanded the French portion of the forces in person, and William Longsword, who had distinguished himself in the Fifth Crusade, with many other English knights and nobles, vowed that they would serve under his banner. Egypt was again made the objective point of the expedition, and after an unnecessary and imprudent delay of 8 months at Cyprus, Louis sailed in 1248 for Egypt with a force of 50,000 men. The history of this crusade is but a narrative of the defeats of the Christians by the arms of their enemies, by famine and by pestilence. At Mansoura in 1250, the Crusaders were totally routed. 30,000 Christians were slain, among them the flower of the French and English chivalry, and King Louis himself was taken prisoner. He was only ransomed by the surrender of Damietta to the Turks, the conquest of which city had been almost the only successful trophy of the Christian arms. The king proceeded to Acre, almost the only possession of the Christians in Syria, and soon afterward returned to France, thus ending the seventh and penultimate crusade in the year 1254. For 14 years, Syria and Palestine were left to the inadequate protection that could be afforded by the Knights Templars and Hospitallers, two orders who, even in the face of their common foe, could not restrain their own bitter rivalry and dissensions. These feelings culminated at length in a sanguinary battle between them, in which the Templars were almost completely destroyed. The Latin kingdom of Palestine being thus enfeebled by the intestine broils of its defenders, city after city was surrendered to the Moslems until Acre alone remained in the hands of the Christians. In 1268, the heaviest blow was inflicted by the fall of Antioch, the proud capital of Syria. 40,000 Christians were slain at the time of its surrender, and 100,000 were sold into slavery. The fall of the Christian state of Antioch was a catastrophe that once more aroused the military ardor and the pious spirit of Europe, and a new crusade was inaugurated, the eighth and last, for the recovery of the Holy Land, the restoration of the Latin kingdom, and the extirpation of the infidels from the sacred territory.